This is the last shoulder training video you'll need to watch in this decade. Today, I'm giving you the step-by-step science-based blueprint to bigger delts. I'll cover the anatomy of the shoulders, what the research shows the most effective shoulder hypertrophy exercises are, exactly how to set up your program for maximum delt growth, and common delt training myths. First, let's cover the anatomy of the delts, something many are confused about. The shoulder joint is perhaps the most versatile joint in the body in terms of range of motion. As a ball and socket joint, as opposed to a simpler hinge joint like the elbow, the shoulder can be moved in many different planes. While most people think of the shoulders as a smaller muscle group, it actually isn't. Several studies have measured and compared the size of different muscle groups in the upper body. The delts are consistently the biggest in the whole upper body. Growing your delts can have a huge impact on your overall physique, arguably even bigger than growing your chest or your back. The delts can be further subdivided into the front or anterior delt, the side or lateral delt, and the rear or posterior delt. However, some research actually suggests that the delts have more than just 3 divisions. A 2010 study from Japan found that contrary to popular belief, the anterior and posterior deltoid had 3 intramuscular tendons each, resulting in 3 subdivisions each, for a total of 7 deltoid subdivisions. Several studies have had similar findings. As a result, the deltoids are not only the largest muscle group in the upper body, they're also much more complex than most lifters assume. In terms of training, this suggests you likely want to train them like you do the back. Pick a decent variety of exercises that hit the delts from different angles to cover all segments well. As far as functions go, we can split the anterior, lateral, and posterior segments as follows. The anterior deltoids are primarily responsible for shoulder flexion, abduction, and horizontal adduction. The lateral deltoid is primarily responsible for shoulder abduction, flexion, and horizontal abduction. Finally, the posterior deltoids are primarily responsible for shoulder extension and horizontal abduction. You'll notice that the anterior and lateral deltoids share the role of shoulder abduction and flexion, whereas the lateral and posterior deltoids share the functions of horizontally abducting the shoulder. So, there'll absolutely be some overlap. While this is a topic of ongoing debates, when you overhead press, your lateral delts will absolutely get some stimulus. When you perform lateral raises, your anterior delts will get worked. If you do some rear delt flies, your lateral delts get some stimulus. In fact, even bench pressing will likely work your lateral delts to an extent, since they're shoulder flexors, though it's unlikely they'll be the limiting muscle group. The same applies for rows, since the lateral delt is also responsible for horizontal shoulder abduction. This means that even just the compound basics may be enough for some delt growth. However, when it comes to delt training, there is a big ongoing debate. Should you train the anterior, lateral, and posterior deltoids equally, or should you focus mostly on direct lateral deltoid training? My friend Jeff Nippard, for example, has often cited this infamous 1989 study out of Germany, where scientists assessed the size of the delts in bodybuilders compared to non-lifters. Jeff often mentions that the researchers found the anterior delts were 5 times bigger in lifters compared to non-lifters, whereas the lateral delts were only 3 times bigger in bodybuilders than in non-lifters. Unfortunately, that's only what I've heard Jeff say, as the paper is only available as a physical copy in a few libraries in Germany. Even through asking Jeff to provide the citation directly and reaching out to a researcher in Germany, I wasn't able to actually get a hold of this study. I'm personally pretty skeptical of these numbers and would love to see a replication of these results. While it's possible that bodybuilders have insane anterior delt development and relatively lackluster lateral and posterior delt development, I think the difference is likely overblown. After all, alongside doing a lot of pushing movements, most pro bodybuilders also include a ton of lateral raises and back work. On the flip side, my friend Dr. Mike Israetel has gone on record saying he doesn't do any direct anterior or posterior delt training, and that he recommends only doing 10 to 30% of your shoulder training as direct front or rear delt work. While I agree that the anterior, posterior, and even lateral deltoids will get some stimulus from pushing and pulling movements, I don't think you should skip the direct anterior and posterior delts work altogether. Your arms get plenty of work during compound movements, but for your best arms, you still include curls and extensions. The same should go for the anterior and the posterior delts. This is doubly true given that the anterior and posterior delts have 3 subdivisions each and likely benefit from direct training and greater variation. I personally fall somewhere in the middle. I think a slight bias on the lateral delts is a good idea. They're the most important part of the delts aesthetically. However, given just how big and complex the delts are as a muscle group, I think you're missing out on a big chunk of growth if you skip the direct anterior and posterior delt work. Before we move into exercise selection, a quick word from my sponsor for this video, Creatine Gummies by Tasty Gains. Creatine monohydrate is one of the only supplements worth taking for more hypertrophy. After the recent videos by James Smith, I know many of you are worried about the legitimacy of creatine gummies. So I asked Tasty Gains to send me the latest results from the most recent third-party tests, which they do frequently. Here they are on the screen. Many supplement companies are shady. Always look for third-party testing. The reason I'm able to endorse and continue to consume creatine gummies by Tasty Gains is because they consistently perform third-party testing and the gummies contain what it says on the label. They're tasty, and if you're looking for an alternative to powder creatine, I highly recommend them. I'll leave a link in the description if you'd like to check them out. Back to the video. Now that we've broken down the anatomy of the delts, here are the best exercises for the anterior, lateral, and posterior delts. I'll give 2 main exercises for each compartment of the delts. I think that's the bare minimum per week to cover the delts well. I'll give alternatives to each exercise in case you don't have the equipment required to do it. First, the 3 subdivisions of the anterior deltoid. The best front delt compound, the high incline neutral grip dumbbell press. The neutral grip makes it natural to tuck your elbows a lot more and emphasize shoulder flexion, which is the primary role of the anterior deltoids, over shoulder horizontal adduction, which is the primary role of the pecs. You could absolutely set the bench to a full 90 degrees overhead and do an overhead press instead. In fact, that's one of the substitutes I would recommend. However, the overhead press actually reduces stretch of the anterior delts slightly. Additionally, some research suggests that some lifters may lack the mobility required to externally rotate their shoulders to 90 degrees while pressing directly overhead. So, adopting a neutral grip both emphasizes the anterior delts more and makes it easier to get into position. To perform the high incline neutral grip dumbbell press, set the bench to 60 or 75 degrees incline. Kick the dumbbells into position explosively and successively, while keeping your elbows tucked to about 15 to 45 degrees for maximum anterior delt stimulus. Press up forcefully. Control the dumbbells back down, pause briefly, and repeat. The first alternative is the dip, which I think of as a squat of the upper body. Not only do you get very solid pec and tricep stimulus, you also get a crazy anterior delt stretch. Keep your elbows tucked and focus on shoulder extension. Alternatively, the seated overhead press is a good option, which increases stability and reduces fatigue compared to standing variations. However, it's unlikely you'll maximize anterior delt growth if you're only ever doing compound movements, where other muscles can give out first. The best front delt isolation, the seated cable front raise. Start by setting a bench to 90 degrees. Set up the cables so your forearm and the cable form a 90-degree angle at the start of the rep. This will increase resistance in the stretch. Raise the cables until you feel resistance drop off. This is by design. Control the descent, pause, and explode up again. You can do half your sets with your shoulder in a neutral position and half with your shoulder internally rotated to ensure all 3 subdivisions get stimulated. This exercise isolates shoulder flexion, has plenty of stretch, is highly stable, and involves minimal fatigue. If getting cables at your gym is difficult, you can do incline dumbbell front raises instead. Just like incline curls, these focus on the stretch a bit more than standard front raises. Let's move on to the lateral deltoid. The best lateral delt exercise, the behind the back dual cable lateral raise. You get a deeper stretch than with dumbbells. You can bias the resistance in the stretch by raising the cable to be perpendicular to your forearm at the bottom, and you still get to train both arms at once. Emphasize the cue out, not up. Many lifters hit the traps a bit more than the side delts by focusing on upward motion rather than moving the handles out in an arc, which focuses more so on shoulder abduction. That said, getting 2 cables all by yourself might be asking for too much in most gym contexts. The single arm variant is a great alternative. If all you have are dumbbells, the seated dumbbell lateral raise is a favorite of mine. Less fatiguing and less potential for cheating than standing. While it does have less resistance in the stretch than the cable lateral raise, this may not be a deal breaker. Along with some fellow researchers, I co-authored the only study to date on muscle growth of the delts. We compared the lateral delt hypertrophy from either doing cable lateral raises or dumbbell lateral raises. However, in order to isolate the impact of resistance profile on hypertrophy, we matched for range of motion. The arm stopped when it reached the bottom position of the dumbbell lateral raise, even in the cable lateral raise condition. In our study, we found that the cable lateral raise, which has more resistance in the stretch, and the dumbbell lateral raise led to similar lateral delt hypertrophy in trained lifters. However, since the resistance in the stretch in the dumbbell lateral raise is minimal, I usually make up for it a little bit by doing lengthened supersets. I start by doing 3 to 6 reps all the way overhead. I personally just find starting the set by doing this enjoyable, but you could totally just go to parallel instead. I let range of motion drop off until I literally can't move the dumbbells anymore. To take the stretch emphasis up a notch, here's a tip. Keep grinding through the sticking point for at least a few seconds on every rep. When most lifters do partials, they just blast through them. Being intentional and giving it your absolute all on every rep at the sticking point might make up for the lack of stretch stimulus on the dumbbell lateral raise. Finally, another alternative is the dumbbell upright row. If I'm short on time, I'll throw these in. They're the compound equivalent of lateral raises. Not only do I get lateral delt stimulus, I also get biceps. While many lifters think upright rows are bad for your shoulders because they increase the risk of impingement, this probably isn't true. I won't go into detail in this video, but I will leave a video in the description that goes into the research on impingement and the lack of research on upright rows actually being injurious. Upright rows are a great movement to add to your shoulder routine if you're short on time. However, this first exercise trained your lateral delt through shoulder abduction. To ensure all lateral delt fibers are growing, it's likely worth doing a second exercise that trains the lateral delts through a slightly different arm path, the lying cross-body lateral raise. Resistance is maximized when your arm is parallel to the floor, in the stretch position of the lateral delts. While the research suggests this will likely lead to more muscle growth, the lack of tension at the top of this movement can feel a little bit awkward to some lifters. If you would like an alternative, try the cross-body cable Y raise. It accomplishes the same thing, but it can feel smoother for many lifters. Let's move on to the posterior deltoids. The best exercise for the posterior delts is probably the rear delt cable fly, whether performed single arm or with both arms at once. Because the posterior delts have 3 compartments with individual tendons, I like to vary the cable height. I'll do high to low, shoulder height, and low to high as 3 different variations that target slightly different compartments of the posterior delts. If you're worried about side-to-side asymmetries, just switch which arm goes on top every set. If I can't get both cables, I'll just do them single arm, or I'll grab a dumbbell and do lying rear delt dumbbell flies instead. Just like cross-body lateral raises, this one maximizes resistance in the stretch. You should feel a posterior delt stretch like nothing else here. While switching up the height of the rear delt cable fly covers you pretty well, I sometimes add a cable face pull variation in. After all, the posterior delts are also responsible for external rotation of the shoulder. My favorite is the twisting cable face pull. You get a way deeper stretch of the posterior delt than you do during a traditional cable face pull. Make sure you twist away from the cable to get as much range as possible. Bring your hand up until you're hitting a bicep pose. Alternatively, if you'd like to train both arms at once, the traditional cable face pull can work, especially if you're focusing on the stretch with your second posterior delt exercise. Now that we've covered anatomy and exercise selection, let's talk about how to actually put together the most effective shoulder workout program possible. We'll cover the best training splits, the optimal volume, exercise order, proximity to failure, range of motion, how often you should change exercises, rest times, rep ranges, special techniques with trying, progressive overload, and the most common mistakes you should avoid. We'll put together a few sample workout routines you can use throughout this section. You can build your own if you follow along. Let's start with training split and volume. You'll commonly hear that because the delts are such small muscles, you can train them really often and still recover. There's 2 issues with this claim. First, as we've shown, the delts are actually maybe the biggest upper body muscle group. Secondly, the claim is that training bigger muscle groups is more fatiguing, so you can't do it as often effectively. However, scientifically, that idea isn't really based on much. The most direct research we have is studies that examine the effect of training frequency on muscle growth. If there was truth to the idea that smaller muscles benefit from being trained more often than larger ones, all else being equal, we would see greater hypertrophy in the lower body with lower frequencies, but greater hypertrophy in the upper body with higher frequencies. And yet, training a muscle more often is generally neutral to slightly beneficial for muscle growth, and that is true for both upper and lower body muscles. With all that being said, most people are under-training their delts. The recovery timeline after a workout depends completely on volume, proximity to failure, the exercise used, the rep range used, your recovery abilities, and more. You'll often see 48 or 72 hours floating around on TikTok for recovery timelines. But this is only true under very specific circumstances. The first time you do a workout, for example, the recovery is probably longer than usual on account of your body not being used to that stimulus yet. While we don't have direct research on the optimal volume for delt training just yet, it is likely that the delts grow their best at similar volumes as other muscle groups. Like the biceps and triceps, they likely get a solid amount of stimulus from compound movements. The anterior deltoids in particular get trained very well during bench pressing, dips, and push-ups, for example. Since the shoulder gets hyperextended during these movements, the anterior delts are placed under an intense stretch. They also contribute to shoulder horizontal adduction alongside the pecs. So it is likely worth counting each set of pressing as half a set for your anterior delts. For maximum growth, the biggest study on training volume suggests one to do around 20 to 30 weekly sets. Assuming you're doing around 20 sets of pressing for your pecs and your triceps per week, the equivalent of around 10 sets for your anterior delts, you would likely want to add in another 10 to 20 direct sets for your anterior deltoids. The posterior delts also get trained during pulling movements. They contribute to both shoulder extension and shoulder horizontal abduction. However, unlike the anterior delts, they never get close to a full stretch during compound back training. And most back exercises are hardest in the contracted position. We can still count most back movements as half a set for the posterior delts, but we likely want to do more direct volume for the posterior delts than the anterior delts. However, you are also likely doing more sets for your lats and your upper back combined compared to your chest work. So those two factors compensate for one another, meaning you would likely want to add in another 10 to 20 direct sets for your posterior delts to bring the total to 20 to 30 per week. The lateral deltoids are a bit different. They are trained both during rows via shoulder horizontal abduction slightly, and they get trained slightly during pressing movements via shoulder flexion. They likely also get trained during anterior delt training, which focuses on shoulder flexion, and during direct posterior delt training, which focuses on horizontal shoulder abduction. Since the lateral delt, however, is so important for shoulder width from both the front and the rear, going a bit higher in direct training volume for the average trainee is a safe bet, aiming for 15 to 25 direct sets per week. As always, if you're increasing your training volume, do it gradually and pay attention to your performance in the gym. If it keeps improving or it stays consistent, keep adding volume. Once you've reached your desired volume, I'd recommend sticking to that volume continuously. So, what routine should you use? You might be tempted to add a shoulder day into your routine, but that probably won't be the best approach. Instead, the biggest study on per session volume suggests that you probably want to add 1 day of delt training per 5 to 10 sets per week for the delts you perform. This is because doing much more than around 10 sets for the delts in a single workout won't necessarily increase muscle growth any further. Since we're shooting for 10 to 25 sets for the anterior, lateral, and posterior delts per week, hitting the delts 2 to 4 times a week is the sweet spot. If you're training all muscle groups pretty equally and sticking closer to 10 weekly sets, aim for 2 workouts per week for the delts. Upper lower 4 days a week, full body 3 to 5 times a week, or even push pull legs 6 days a week works really well here. However, if you're really trying to bring up your delts and you're shooting closer to 25 weekly sets for each of the compartments, aim for full workouts a week. A 6-day modified upper lower or a 4 to 5 day full body split can both work great here. But how should you structure your upper body, push, pull, or even full body days for shoulder training? The most recent study out of Brazil suggests that exercise order doesn't impact muscle growth much. Just to hedge your bets, I would still personally recommend starting your workouts with your upper body compound movements before doing your delt isolation exercises. If you're really trying to bring up your delts, you can experiment with starting workouts with delt exercises, but you might be trading off some growth elsewhere in your physique. There is one exception. If you're running a full body workout, I have found that doing delt training before leg training is better than doing it after leg training. Leg training can be so fatiguing that the quality of delt training goes down drastically if you attempt to do it right afterwards. The same proximity to failure recommendations can be applied to shoulder training as every other muscle group. The largest study on the topic by Robinson and colleagues shows that the closer a set is taken to failure, the more muscle that set grows. However, since taking every set to failure, especially early into a workout, can compromise performance for the remainder of the workout, potentially reducing overall tension across that session, I generally recommend keeping about 2 reps in reserve on the first set, inching closer to failure with every set until you hit true failure on the last set. When it comes to training to failure, there is one technique I heavily recommend using, and I'll touch on it in the special techniques section. Moving on to range of motion, try to think of the delt's functions. They do not attach at the scapula, so as a rule of thumb, try to focus on movement of the shoulder and not the scapula. For lateral raises, try to raise your arm in an arc rather than straight up. For rear delt flies, try to bring your arms back in an arc rather than just straight back. Notice the difference in upper back involvement. There is nothing wrong with scapular movement, especially during compound movements where your aim is to target many muscles at once. But when it comes to isolation movements, focus on shoulder motion rather than scapular motion to ensure your delts get the full stimulus. Based on the research I've co-authored on the stretch for muscle growth, a full range of motion or just partial reps in the stretch position will be roughly equally effective for muscle building. It's possible that partials are superior for muscle growth, and I personally focus on them quite heavily, but either approach will work well. How often should you change exercises? Changing exercises too often is a bad idea, since you'll struggle to build the skill required to really push heavy loads on that exercise, especially if you're a beginner. Likewise, changing too infrequently often means doing an exercise that isn't maximally effective anymore. My rule of thumb is that you should change an exercise as infrequently as possible. You should only change it if it causes you pain consistently, if you genuinely think there is a more effective alternative available for you that you weren't aware of previously, or if you've simply gotten bored of it and aren't pushing it as hard as possible anymore. However, erring on the side of changing exercises less often allows you to progressively overload week upon week for months on end. This is where you can have high confidence that muscle growth is occurring. When it comes to rest times, 60 to 90 seconds between sets is likely best for deltoid hypertrophy. We conducted the largest meta-analysis on rest times for muscle hypertrophy and found that 1 to 2 minutes of rest between sets outperformed less than 60 seconds of rest and was similarly effective as 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 minutes of rest. For shoulder isolation work, I would aim for around 60 seconds of rest between sets. For compound deltoid exercises like overhead presses, I would aim for 90 seconds, since more total muscle was recruited, leading to higher systemic fatigue. Many people rest a lot longer than that because it allows them to perform better, but that's likely not a benefit for hypertrophy. If improved performance was always beneficial to hypertrophy, that would show up in studies comparing shorter and longer rest times, where the groups with long rest times performed better and subsequently would see more hypertrophy. And yet, that's not what we see. There are cases where performance and hypertrophy do differ. Rep ranges for delt training are where many lifters go wrong. Just like for training frequency, many lifters assume that larger muscles should be trained with lower reps, where smaller muscles like the arms and delts should be trained for higher reps, really feeling the burn. Not only are the delts actually a pretty big muscle group, but there's also no real truth to this statement. A systematic review on the topic suggests that provided a set takes somewhere in the ballpark of 20 to 70 seconds, the exact number of reps probably doesn't matter. Another systematic review suggests that sets of around 5 to 50 reps are equally beneficial, provided they're pushed close to failure. There's nothing wrong with going heavy for delt training. In fact, I recommend it. A systematic review I co-authored examined the effects of rep range on accuracy in pushing close to failure. We saw that when lifters did more than about 12 reps, they started under pushing their sets more and more, often missing failure by several reps in their estimates. However, between 5 to 12 reps per set, lifters were gauging failure within a rep of true failure consistently. So, for most lifters, I would recommend doing 50 to 80% of your shoulder training in the 5 to 12 rep range. If you're really confident you can hit failure even on higher rep sets, you can include sets of 15 to 20 and 20 to 32. Higher reps are also more systemically fatiguing. You'll burn more calories per set doing higher reps than lower reps, all else being equal, and feel more out of breath after a set of high reps than low reps. That being said, you might grow a bit more muscle by including some higher rep training in your program. Since overhead presses, face pulls, and upright rows involve more muscle mass and are already more systemically fatiguing as a result, they typically work best in the 5 to 15 rep range. If you're going to include higher rep work, use it on isolation exercises like lateral raises, rear delt flies, or front raises. Let's talk about progressive overload. As ubiquitous as progressive overload is, we only have one study comparing different progressive overload strategies. The researchers compared adding reps week to week to adding weight week to week and found similar muscle growth in the quads and the calves. Most YouTubers correctly recommend using double progression for delt training, but there are exceptions to this rule. To use double progression, start by picking your rep range. Start with a weight you can do for the bottom end of the rep range, and every week try to add a rep to the first set for that exercise. You might get that jump in some weeks, you might not notice, and that's fine. When you reach the top end of the rep range, add weight. This should drop you back to the lower end of the rep range. Repeat the process. Now, this double progression approach works well for most movements, but not all. There's a concept I call the micro-loadability ratio. To calculate it, just divide the absolute load you're using by the smallest increment you can adjust the load by for the exercise. If you're using 20-pound dumbbells for lateral raises and your dumbbells run in 5-pound increments, you get a ratio of 4. Compare this to a heavy overhead press. I've overhead pressed 225 pounds for a rep. The smallest increment I could adjust the weight by for that set would be 5 pounds. If I calculate that ratio, I get a ratio of 45. That's a much higher micro-loadability ratio. For movements with a higher micro-loadability ratio, you're typically better off trying to add weight week to week rather than reps. In fact, for movements with a high micro-loadability ratio, adding reps week to week might be harder than just adding the smallest available weight increment. So, for your delt training, use a double progression for movements with a low micro-loadability ratio, but use a weight progression for movements with a high micro-loadability ratio. If you're in doubt about which to use, try checking it out with a 1-rep max calculator. Would adding a rep result in a bigger jump in your estimated max, or adding weight? Before we move on to the most common shoulder training mistakes, let's discuss special techniques for the delts. There are a few that are worth discussing. First, lengthen partials and lengthen supersets. Many shoulder exercises bias the shortened or middle part of the movement, dumbbell lateral raises, cable face pulls, and even most overhead pressing variations. Doing some partials in the stretch position after hitting failure, or even as the whole set, is a great way to get a bit more stretch bias and likely see more muscle growth as a result. I personally do all movements as lengthened partials for hypertrophy. Second, drop sets. A meta-analysis by Coleman and colleagues compared drop sets to traditional training. Both approaches led to the same hypertrophy, but drop sets took 50 to 70% less time to complete. So, if you're short on time but you're trying to cram in some more delt training into your routine, try drop sets. I would recommend doing these later or last in the workout to manage fatigue. Finally, another time saver, antagonistic paired supersets. We have several studies showing these cause as much growth as traditional training, but in up to 30 to 40% less time. Antagonist paired supersets can work well with both anterior and posterior delt training. Try supersetting an overhead, incline press, or even a front raise with a back movement. Or try supersetting a face pull or a delt fly variation with a chest movement. Or you can even try supersetting an anterior and posterior delt movement, followed by a drop set for your lateral delts for time-efficient shoulder training. You can even superset a shoulder exercise with a completely non-overlapping exercise, like a calf raise or a crunch. Let's talk about the most common mistakes I see with delt training. The first mistake I see all the time is neglecting both your anterior and your posterior delts. The delts are the biggest muscle in the upper body, and they're arguably the most important muscle for an impressive V-taper. Avoiding direct training for roughly 2/3 of your delts is probably a bad idea. You train your biceps directly, you train your triceps directly, and those are smaller than your delts. So, you should give your anterior and posterior delts the same attention, if not more, than your arms. The other big mistake I see people making with delt training is sticking to the same 3 exercises they always have and missing the stretch. Dumbbell ladder raises are a good exercise, but you're probably better off with their dual cable ladder raises. Most people still train their posterior delts only with cable face pulls or rear delt machine flies, both of which neglect the stretch position. Finally, the way most people do their overhead presses, their anterior delts never even see the stretch position. Don't be afraid to experiment with different exercises and lean into the stretch. Alright, that's the full shoulder training blueprint. Let me know what you thought of this video in the comments below, and consider subscribing. There's a ton more in-depth videos like this one coming. I'd also like to give a shout out to my training app, MyoAdapt. MyoAdapt is basically your smart coach in your pocket, building science-based programs that actually fit your lifestyle, your schedule, and your goals. Whether you want to build bigger shoulders, emphasize the lateral delts specifically, but not the anterior delts, train from your home gym, or just finish faster on a busy day, it adapts around you. Go to myoadapt.com now and use code WOLF for a free 2-week trial. Alternatively, if you would like me to coach you directly, check out the link below and we'll have a free call to see if it's a good match. Have a phenomenal week, and I will see you in that next one.